Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. As promised in my previous upload, this is the full interview between myself and Paul Scharre, who took some time to answer my questions regarding the topic of drones being used against tanks. If you haven't seen that video yet, I highly recommend you watch it first and then come back to this one, as it will give you a bit more of an understanding of the history behind the topic. If you've already seen it though, or would just rather watch the interview, sit back and enjoy this unedited interview. I hope you find it interesting.
Good. Yeah, thanks for reaching out.
Yeah, well, thank you for taking the time to answer some of my questions. I'm sure you must be busy, so I do appreciate it. Especially for someone who is just, some random YouTube channel reaching out.
No, I'm happy to. Happy to. Took a look at your videos and they're great, and happy to chat. I mean, it's a great topic too.
Yeah, I've been seeing a lot of comments on my channel, so I figured I'd reach out to somebody that knows more than I do, because most of the stuff I found out there is just like random news articles, and you don't know what you can trust with those. So
Yeah. Well, this issue of sort of like, tanks versus drones, or drones versus tanks, really, because it's kind of a one-way thing, is a hot topic of discussion,
yeah.
certainly among experts in the defense space. So, very excited to chat with you about it.
Well, before we start, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself to my viewers so that they sort of kind of understand who you are and why they can trust you on this topic?
Absolutely. So I'm Paul Scharre. I'm the Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for New American Security. I'm the author of 4 Battlegrounds, Power in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, and I'm a former U.S. Army Ranger, and I served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Okay. So I guess we can just get right into the questions now. So to start off with, to many, drones are considered a relatively new invention. But when would you say that the drone, as we see it today, really sort of took off? Because they've been around since like the 20s, which a lot of people don't fully understand.
That's right. Drones in simple form have been around for decades, but played really a fairly marginal role in warfare until pretty recently. So it really wasn't until the post 9/11 era that we saw drones come into their own. It's just a really core aspect of military operations for the United States and its operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, going after terrorists, tracking terrorist networks. Drones became this absolutely essential tool, not actually for drone strikes, which is, I think, where there's a lot of media attention. That's where people tend to go when you think about drones, think about drone strikes. The U.S. military doesn't have a problem dropping bombs actually on targets. They have a whole lot of aircraft that can do that. But the ability to have persistent overhead surveillance over targets, that was what makes drones so valuable, both to the U.S. military and counterterrorism operations, and in other places today, like in Ukraine. And that's one of the things that drones bring that's a game changer on the battlefield.
Okay, so when would you say that drones first were seen in an anti-tank role? Because I know there's not a lot of reporting on that up until fairly recently, at least that I've seen.
Well, certainly we saw drones being used in a pretty significant way against tanks in Nagorno-Karabakh a few years ago, and that put a lot of attention on people's radar screen about what is the potential for drones in this kind of environment, in a more conventional conflict. I think for defense analysts who were following these issues closely, it wasn't necessarily a surprise that we were expecting to see drones used in this way. ISIS actually had used, fairly crude drones against Iraqi ground forces, going after both personnel and armored vehicles. And of course, as viewers will know, tanks are fairly vulnerable to attack from the air because they have much less armor on top. But certainly we're seeing drones continue to be used in a number of very significant ways in Ukraine, either for direct attack themselves, carrying weapons, or as spotters for artillery. And I think that's going to continue to be an important role that drones play in anti-tank warfare in particular.
Yeah, that makes sense. I believe during my research, I ran across a story where they were essentially saying that was it an Iraqi Abrams was actually damaged, or the commander was killed by a drone strike by, I believe it was an ISIS drone. Not sure if you're familiar with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty remarkable that ISIS, without state sponsorship, without sophisticated technology, was able to develop a drone air force effectively, and was able to carry out successful attacks against Iraqi forces cause casualties, damage vehicles. It was not a decisive factor in the conflict, but they were successful in harassing Iraqi forces and impeding their operations. Now, the U.S., after this began to affect their Iraqi allies, the U.S. got involved and engaged in a pretty sophisticated counter-drone effort against ISIS, some of which was things in terminal defense, so things like jamming drones or simply shooting them down. Drones are very vulnerable to ground fire. I've actually had a friend who shot a drone out of the sky early on in the war in Iraq, before there were any ISIS drones. And he was super excited. He's like, I got a drone kill. And I was like, that's one of ours, right? Because at the time it was only our drones. But drones are very vulnerable to even simple countermeasures, like bullets are going to take down a small commercially available drone, for example. But the thing the U.S. also did is the U.S. went after their drone makers. And that was a very effective operation in terms of just simply dismantling ISIS's capability in manufacturing and building drones, as the U.S. has been able to do in counterterrorism operations in other ways. And it's probably safe to say, actually, their drones were used by the U.S. to go after the people making the ISIS drones. So we got drones on all sides.
Well, I guess that can bring us back into the main topic that I have for this video. And I've got this. We've seen a lot about drones being used against armored vehicles in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Do you think drones will continue to be a major threat to tanks, or was that early success that we saw only temporary?
I think we're going to see over time the battlefield environment become more transparent and more lethal in ways that are going to be very difficult for ground forces, and in particular for armored vehicles. So I think we've seen a number of shifts, and drones are part of this shift in ground warfare that is going to make the warfare environment much more challenging for armored vehicles like tanks. So I do think it's the case that drones are going to continue to be a persistent threat for armored vehicles on the ground. It's not, as simple as saying like the tank is dead. We're going to continue to see tanks used in modern warfare. And, it's not that drones are always going to be able to find tanks, or always going to be able to attack them. We're certainly seeing in the case of Russia's military, they don't have very good effective defenses against drones, but also they're not very capable across the board. We've seen the Russian military, is showing itself to be incompetent at basically a whole range of, basic military tasks, whether it's logistics or maintenance or other things. And so that's not necessarily indicative of how other militaries are going to perform. There are countermeasures against drones. They're vulnerable to jamming, right? Vulnerable to ground fire. One of the things we're seeing in Ukraine is these counter drone attacks where actually Russia is using electronic warfare to pinpoint the drone operators and then call artillery in on them. So these innovations of drones and counter drones are going to evolve. But I do think over the long run, it's going to make the environment more transparent, more lethal in ways that are really hard for armored ground vehicles. And I think probably the role of tanks in warfare is going to change over time.
Yeah. Well, that actually answered one of my other questions, because I was going to ask about the countermeasures, but you kind of touched on that. So what do you think in terms of the effectiveness of, because we've seen both civilian style drones and the larger, I know there's a specific Turkish drone that the Ukrainians were using. Yeah. So which of those is more effective against armor, and are the civilian type effective in general, or are they better for more of a reconnaissance role?
Yeah, great question. Well, certainly we're seeing both of the larger military specific drones, like in this case, the Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drone that's being used in Ukraine, as well as small commercially available drones like quadcopters and hexcopters. In general, the larger military specific system is going to be bigger. They're going to have longer range and endurance. They're going to carry better payloads, including just larger quantities or larger sizes of weapons. And they might have better sensors on them. But they also cost more, and they might be operating up at higher altitudes where they're more vulnerable to detection and then to ground fire. So there is a bit of a trade-off. Sometimes the smaller, cheaper, expendable, commercial systems that might be able to fly low over the treetops might have some advantages. So it's not necessarily that the military systems are always going to be better. we're seeing drones used for a couple of key purposes. So one is for direct attack against ground vehicles. And both of these drones have been used in that way, both the military ones and the commercial ones.
Yeah.
Although, of course, the military ones can carry larger weapons payloads. We're also seeing them used for reconnaissance, just spotting ground forces. That's really the primary advantage that they bring, is their persistence, their ability to stay in the air for long periods of time and to find ground forces. That's like the main advantage that drones bring. In addition, for Ukraine, to lowering the cost of air power. So obviously it's a lot cheaper to send up a quadcopter than to invest in, a crewed or manned fighter jet and to send that up in the air. And then, of course, the risk calculus is different, right? So if a drone gets shot down, even if it's a military drone like a TB2, that's much easier to replace than a crewed aircraft, where now you have to replace the pilot. That's the hard, right? You have to retrain a pilot, and that's obviously not easy to do. It's, in fact, the point of discussion in a lot of these weapon systems that the U.S. and allies are talking about sending to Ukraine, whether it's the Abrams or F-16s, it's, okay, what's the training pipeline to get there? So that's another major advantage of drones, is the pilot, again, taking into account these concerns are raised about countermeasures, but the pilot at least is not on the drone itself. And then, of course, there are lots of instances where the drones are being used for target acquisition, being spotters for artillery. But we also have instances where particularly some of the small quadcopters are being used for propaganda purposes.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of videos of the drones filming attacks by ground forces on Russian troops. Right? We've seen these videos come out, and you'll see the Ukrainian defenders come out with anti-tank weapons and attack Russian tanks, or they're filming attacks using artillery, or even some cases, weapons on the drones themselves. And all of that is, really meaningful and impactful from the propaganda standpoint, where Ukraine has just absolutely dominated the information environment. And they continue to flood the zone with these videos of the valiant Ukrainian defenders defending against the Russians, showing their successes on the ground. That has a pretty direct effect, and then political support in European capitals and in Washington, and then more flow of weapons. So I wouldn't want to discount that either, that the information warfare aspect of drones is also really valuable.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So going back just a little bit onto the countermeasures aspect, are you familiar with any particular things that tanks have that can be used as countermeasures against drones, or have we yet to see that sort of come into play?
I'm not aware of any systems that have been designed that are on tanks today that are specifically used to counter against drones, but there's a lot of things that would absolutely work and have been used in other contexts. So, for example, jammers or high-powered microwave weapons that can zap drones out of the sky, fry the electronics, those exist. Those have been used in other contexts. They would just need to be mounted on a tank, for example. Certainly machine guns, super effective against drones. So that also is the kind of thing that could be mounted against tanks. So when you look at something like an active protection system for ground vehicles that a number of countries have, that's designed to shoot down RPGs or other anti-tank munitions, missiles, or rockets coming in, that's actually a much harder problem than shooting down a drone. It's going to be much more difficult to shoot down, an RPG or an anti-tank rocket coming in against a tank, and having an active protection system take that out. Very doable. That's not new technology. So the drones are pretty vulnerable. Just because, again, we don't see Russia doing it very effectively doesn't mean that another country wouldn't do it. If the U.S. was in this position where, another country or a non-state actor, let's say ISIS, was using drones to attack U.S. tanks, or another advanced military, like say Israel, I have all the confidence in the world that they could put together countermeasures that would be pretty effective, again, at least in the near term. The long-term trends, I think, are rough for tanks, but in the near term, there's a whole lot of tools that countries can use.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think a lot of people kind of miss the whole point of that it is very difficult to stop projectiles going towards a tank, and a drone, by comparison, is a relatively slow-moving target, so it's not going to be as difficult as stopping a missile heading extremely fast towards the side of a tank. It's going to be a slower-moving or hovering small thing that they can blast out of the sky, as you were saying.
Right. Like if you look at these videos that are online of drones with some kind of munition on board that are being dropped onto a tank, and there've been some of these videos out there. It's either tanks or ground forces. It's individual troops. And in some cases, there's videos of it actually using it to destroy a tank or to get at least a mission kill against a tank. The lethality that drone is employing is nothing compared to like a javelin, for example. That's just way more lethal and destructive to tanks, much more sophisticated. So like the real threat to tanks is, from a munition standpoint, it's precision guided munitions. In a world of precision guided munitions, and if tanks can be found, it's really hard to make armor that's survivable. And then you have to start layering in defenses, right? So you have to start adding in hard and soft kill defenses. What engineers talk about is the survivability onion. You've got armor as kind of the terminal layer, but then you've got outside that hard kill and soft kill, and then you've got things like decoys and camouflage. Certainly, like not letting them find you would be the best thing, right? And that's where drones come into play. Where drones make that a lot harder to just simply avoid being found in the first place.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's another thing that I see very commonly online where people, they don't seem to understand that it's not, the battlefield isn't a tank driving along and then somebody with a javelin somewhere. There is so much else going on. You have the armor of the vehicle, you have positioning, you have camouflage, you have the guy actually needing to find the tank to shoot at it. It's not just one versus one or one tank versus the other. There's so many other aspects. So it's never a true 1v1 in combat.
Yeah. And that's what makes it hard, I think, in some of these instances to try to pick out, well, what does this tell us about the future of warfare? Because in many cases, we're seeing armor is not being employed very effectively. This was the issue in the ConeOfArc, because people said, well, look, this is a terrible way to use armor. They're not using it in a combined arms fashion. They're not doing camouflage. They're not trying to conceal their positions at all. And similarly in Ukraine, I mean, we just see these horrible tactics by the Russians. They're, just driving right down the road. They've got all their tanks grouped up together. And so they're just sort of, these big juicy targets for an artillery attack. And so like, that's, what would this look like if you had someone employing armor effectively? I think it would be quite different.
Okay, back to drones. So weather conditions play a large role in regular air support operations. Is this something that also affects drones, or does it affect them differently?
It does. It's a great question, but it's going to affect them in different ways. So certainly for traditional crewed aircraft, one big effect is going to be about cloud cover. And so if there's relatively low cloud cover, then it's hard, of course, for the aircraft overhead to see the ground, and it can't effectively support ground forces. Or at least it's going to limit it in many cases. So there might be situations where, if you have good communications, you're relying on GPS-guided systems, for example, then you can still call in a bomb strike using GPS-guided munitions, even if the pilot doesn't have eyes on the ground. But they're kind of close to our support that like an A-10 would do, for example, where you actually have the pilot flying very low, looking at what's going on the ground. And then you've got the ground troops, popping smoke, shooting tracers at a target. That's going to be really hard to do without, if there's cloud cover, for example. So drones could fly lower, and potentially they could get under the cloud cover depending on obviously how low the clouds are. So that's potentially one advantage, particularly if some of these like smaller commercially available systems, quadcopters and hexcopters. Now, the other side is the smaller, lighter weight systems are more vulnerable to heavy winds because they just don't have the same propulsion that they're moving through the air as like a fighter jet's going to have. And so for smaller systems, they actually could be quite vulnerable in like kind of heavy wind environment.
Okay. So speaking of, you kind of mentioned when you were talking about cloud cover that, you have to be able to identify the target. Even regular pilots have to do that. So how difficult is it for someone like a drone operator to identify a target as enemy or friendly, especially when, like we see in Ukraine, both sides are using relatively similar vehicles? I mean, one Russian tank from another, it can be difficult to tell, especially when Ukraine might be using one that they recently captured. So how can they identify that?
Yeah, well, friendly fire is an unfortunate reality of war, even with the most sophisticated militaries, with the best equipment. Certainly, the U.S. military is not immune to this. Now, we don't hear about a lot of friendly fire incidents coming out of Ukraine, but it's also not clear that either side would be very keen to publicize that.
Yeah.
Certainly, like the Russian military is not taking any precautions when it comes to the lives of its service members. I mean, the degree to which they're simply just sort of throwing them into this meat grinders is truly horrific. And on the Ukrainian side, Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian government overall has been very disciplined in their messaging, very intentional. And so the extent that there are fratricide incidents, and you've got to assume a year into a very high intensity war, I'm sure there've been plenty of fratricide incidents. That's not something that they're going to try to publicize and talk too much about. But that's going to happen, right? And it's not to say that militaries can't distinguish between, friendly forces and enemy forces. There are ways to tell, based on what uniforms or weapon systems that others are using. But fog of war, there's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of confusion, mistakes happen. And unfortunately, the consequences of those mistakes can be pretty lethal.
Yeah. So is that the sort of thing that would make coordination with ground forces in the area critical to prevent a sort of friendly fire incident?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you need to know, like, where are your friendly forces? Obviously, this becomes even more critical when you're engaging in relatively close support to ground forces versus whether you're operating in an area where you're really confident there are no friendly forces nearby. And there are advantages to drones here. I mean, the main advantage to drones is because they can loiter for long periods of time. They have high definition cameras. The drone operators can often get a much better picture of their target and what's going on in the environment than, say, a fighter jet that's just zipping overhead.
Yeah. Do you feel that drones in the coming years will play a large role in destroying tanks, or will they just stay as recon? I think I already kind of touched on that one, unless you have anything else that you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think look, in the long run, I think the trends are not good for tanks here. So what does this start to look like over time? I don't think it's the tanks go away, but I think we are likely to shift over the next several decades to a place where tanks begin to play a more secondary role in ground combat, the way that, for being honest, infantry plays today, where we begin to move away from an era where tanks are as they've been, the vanguard of ground combat, and we have tanks at the front lines, and they're engaging in direct fire with the enemy, towards more remote sensing using drones or eventually ground sensors and ground robotics. We're not quite there yet, but it's coming. And long-range precision-guided fires over the horizon. We've seen this shift in other domains of warfare. So precision-guided weapons augured in this shift in the air domain and in the maritime domain. So we are, past the era of dogfighting and air-to-air combat. That's just not how air-to-air combat happens anymore. When you look at air-to-air engagements over the last several decades, there's been this steady shift away from close-in visual range engagements with guns or missiles to beyond visual range engagements with long-range missiles. And that seems to be a persistent shift that's enabled by better sensors and precision-guided weapons. Naval warfare has also changed from, back in World War II, you would ships pulling alongside each other using heavy guns. Now we have an era of surface-to-surface missiles. And if we see another major naval engagement, it's going to be fought through missiles at long range, using over-the-horizon sensors, using long-range radars, and then using precision-guided missiles. And so now we're seeing precision-guided weapons come into the ground warfare domain. And so I think, we're likely to see in the future a transition where by the time a tank gets within range of its sensors and its gun, there's already been attacks on the enemy using drones and then artillery calling in precision-guided munitions. And the tanks still play sort of a mopping up role, the way the infantry might play today, but they're no longer the vanguard of ground forces. Doesn't mean tanks go away. We still have bayonets, but we're a long way from the days of the Swiss pikemen, where that was sort of the preferred method of fighting on the ground, using a long stick and stabbing it at someone. And so I think that may be bad news for those in the armor community, But I do think that's a transition that's going to happen over the next couple of decades.
Yeah, but what we're not going to see is what a lot of people keep quoting of the death of the tank. It's not the death of the tank in any way like it was sort of, you could say, the death of the horse in combat. The tank just plays the role that the horse did, technically. And then we'll just see armor morph into something new, something we haven't seen yet, but the tank will still exist in combat.
I think in like the next couple of decades, I don't think the drone is going to eliminate the tank now. The thing that could completely eliminate tanks would be ground robotics. And we're not quite there yet. Ground robotics is like really hard. There's a lot of clutter on the ground. There's potholes and vegetation. And so it's having a ground robotic vehicle that can navigate autonomously in a military environment is just vastly more difficult than even a self-driving car, because you have the ability to map the environment out. That's going to be really challenging. But when you get there, the real destructive potential of tanks then is breaking apart the iron triangle that governs tank design today. And so engineers talk about the iron triangle between armor, mobility, and lethality. And you can add more armor, for example, but then you're adding more weight, and you've got to either give up mobility, or you've got to scale back lethality, and vice versa, right? So if you want to add in a bigger gun, it's going to add more weight. You got to either take some armor off, or you're going to sacrifice some mobility. You want to get faster, you got to strip away the armor or get a smaller gun. Robotics changes all of that because the physics of the vehicle are the same, but now that there's no people in it, you don't have to think about survivability the same way. And so now you start thinking, well, like, okay, how much armor do I need on this thing if there's nobody inside it? How survivable do I need to make it? And you can start building things that are low cost. They are more attritable. You can build them in larger numbers. It's a real different paradigm for thinking about ground warfare. And that could mean the death of the tank, but I don't think it's around the corner. I think it's going to be a little bit ways away.
Yeah, that's a good point. And my last question I have is that your book, you mentioned it earlier, For Battleground, Power in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, covers AI and military uses for that technology. How significant do you think that AI will be for drones in the future?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because the main limitation of drones is now, by taking the human away, we've also removed from this vehicle the most advanced cognitive processing system on the planet, which is the human brain. And nothing that we have in AI right now can hold a candle to humans' general intelligence.
Yes.
So we can build specialized AI systems that can do very particular tasks. The US Defense Department already using AI for processing drone video feeds. That's what Project Maven did. That's 5 years old now. So we know that AI can be used for various tasks, including for drones, but adding more and more AI capabilities in drones is going to make them smarter, make them more capable. We can then add more autonomy. And so that's going to be absolutely a game changer for using drones on the battlefield. And we'll see over time things like swarms, where we have swarms of autonomous drones cooperating together. That's going to absolutely have a very significant impact in changing how militaries fight.
And what do you think personally on the sort of ethical concerns that a lot of people might have with that, giving control over to a drone with lethal weapons, the ability to essentially think for itself? That is kind of, the whole plot of the Terminator movie, although obviously that's probably not going to happen. But I mean, it does genuinely make a lot of people nervous to think about.
Yeah, it does. It does. When we saw this movie, and it doesn't end well for humans ever.
Yeah.
Right? It never ends well. And the funny thing to me about science fiction, maybe not funny, I guess it's maybe a little dark, but the story that science fiction tells us is that we're going to build these AI systems, and then one day they wake up and they turn on us.
Yeah.
And the reality is that actually the robotic systems that we're building are being born with a gun in their hands. They're already weaponized. Right? We don't have to wait for the AI to go take control of the military. We have robotic systems throughout the military. They're already weaponized. We're adding more AI into them. So these questions about safety, control, legal and moral and ethical issues, I think really important. Are we comfortable handing over life and death decisions to machines? What happens when a predator drone has as much autonomy as a self-driving car? These are really profound and important questions. I've been really involved in these issues over the course of my time working both at the Pentagon and now at the Center for New American Security. It's actually the topic of my first book, Army of None, Autonomous Weapons and the Future of War. And so I think it's really important. Countries have been debating this issue at the United Nations for the better part of the last decade now. And there's no consensus about what to do going forward. There's been some foundational agreements. So countries have said, we all agree that the law of war applies to autonomous weapons. And that's an important first step. But I do think there's more work to be done to figure out, okay, how are we going to use this technology to try to make war more precise, more humane, but also without giving up our humanity in the process?
Yeah, definitely something that we'll have to see how things go as the technology progresses, I guess. But thank you a lot for your assistance on this. It was really nice to talk to you and get these answers. I'm sure it's going to help a lot of people kind of understand more of the nuance of this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for reaching out. Thanks for having me on the show. It's great to talk with you.
Well, is there anywhere else that somebody watching this might be able to go to either find more information from you or just on this topic that would be trustworthy and not just some article that somebody crapped out in an afternoon?
Yeah, so we actually are working on a project here at the Center for New American Security to explore this very issue, the role of drones in the future of warfare and in high-end conventional conflict. So the report's not out yet, but I am very excited about it. And so stay tuned for more from us, and very excited to share that report with you once it's released.
All right. Well, I will leave a link to you guys down in the description of the video when it comes out. And yeah, thank you. I really appreciate this. So that's all I have today, though. So thanks.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, thanks for having me on. And then if you're able to send me the link when it comes out, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Sure thing.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Take care.
All right. Bye.